All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to start this morning's final session. All right, good morning, everybody. We're going to start this morning's session. My name is Peter Moe, and I'm an associate professor of English here at Whitworth. And it's my great pleasure this morning to introduce you all to Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson, the final speaker of this year's Renewing Mind and Heart Conference. Before she takes the stage, I'd like to thank Dr. Davey Henriksen and the Weyerhaeuser Center for gathering us all together this weekend for such an invigorating conference. Thanks, Davey. Let's all do it again sometime. So Dr. Hooten Wilson is the Fletcher Jones Chair of Great Books at Pepperdine University. She took her doctorate from Baylor in 2009, writing a dissertation titled "Who is God? Divine versus Demonic Authority" in the works of Dostoevsky and Flannery O'Connor. What a title. Now buckle up now. She's done quite a bit since that dissertation. Her first book, Giving the Devil His Due, won Christianity Today's Culture and the Arts Prize in 2018. Dr. Hooten Wilson then published a book on Walker Persky and Dostoevsky, followed by another book called Reading Walker Percy's Novels. In March 2022, she published The Scandal of Holiness, which won another Christianity Today award. The following year, she published this book, Reading for the Love of God. For those of you keeping track, that's 5 monographs in 6 years. As she was writing all these books, she also edited a handful of essay collections. She won the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture's Hyatt Prize. She won a Fulbright to the Czech Republic. She won an NEH grant to study Dante in Florence. And she won a grant from the Templeton Foundation. People love giving Dr. Hooten Wilson lots of money to talk about and write about books. Now, sometimes we academics can deceive ourselves. We might publish an article in a specialist journal. Maybe 100 scholars will read it. If we're lucky, maybe a dozen people will cite us, and we think, yeah, man, my work is reaching people. But then there's Dr. Hooten Wilson. Her YouTube channel has over 3,000 followers. When she did a series on Flannery O'Connor, each YouTube video, each of them about 15 minutes or so, racked up 2,000, 3,000, 4,500 views for a video of a professor talking about a book. That's just absolutely incredible. She tours the country speaking at universities, colleges, churches, and conferences. She regularly speaks at and sits on the boards of many classical schools. She even founded her own school, the Sager Classical Academy, whose board she now chairs. She writes for Christianity Today, the National Review, the Gospel Coalition. She's a regular guest on many podcasts. Her work really does reach people, thousands upon thousands of people. As you can see from her CV, Dr. Hooten Wilson is a public intellectual, pushing us, all of us, both inside and beyond the academy, to be better readers. Well, actually, to just be readers in the first place. Here's how she puts it in Reading for the Love of God. In a world that tries to convince us that we are in a world that tries to convince us that we are computers or animals, that treats us like automatons or worker bees, what better protest than the reading life? If we are to be fully human, we must practice human acts, civility, creativity, contemplation, and charity. Reading well, Dr. Hooten Wilson argues, is foundational for our humanity. And we learn to read well through our education, through those precious relationships between author and reader, between teacher and student. To that end, her talk today is entitled Education as Witness. I hear echoes of that title in this little bit of wisdom also from Reading for the Love of God. One cannot be a teacher without first spending time as a silent student. I'll take that as my cue to sit down as we welcome Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson.
Thank you, Peter. That was a great way to start. And thank you, Davey, for bringing us here, for starting this conversation, which I hope really is just starting. as a conversation. It's somewhat intimidating and maybe humbling, to use the word that Glenn brought up last night, to be the closing speaker of such an event. And especially as I've been able to hear the breakout sessions and then have conversations with multiple people in this room, that if there is a hope for Christian higher education right now, it's every single person in here. That all of you are doing the good work, that if I was going to be real, I was gonna sit down and just listen to all of you, because you have so many ideas and so much experience. And what can someone like me bring into this space that just helps support the good work that I know that you're already doing? And so that's what I'm hoping to do this morning, is I'm hoping to just let the Spirit use this time. I think of Flannery O'Connor, who said that every time she sat down to write, she just wanted to be God's typewriter. Or in The Diary of a Country Priest, the priest actually says, I'm nothing more than the fire poker in God's hands, right? He said, I myself have the miracle of empty hands, that everything that I give, I'm receiving. And so I want to start this morning by praying a prayer that invites the Spirit here, that helps us think and imagine the work that we're doing, that we take it back home with us in a lasting and real way that hopefully we can practice when we get back into those spaces. The prayer I'm going to use is from Walter Brueggemann, who, in good Christian faith integration style, started all of his classes over a 40-year career by praying, by being inspired oftentimes by a psalm or something that they were reading in the course, and then actually writing these prayers to fit the classroom. I think too often we denigrate the practice of praying before we start our classes, because we're a little bit concerned, like Jamie said, that we're going to become DeVry with the chapel, right? Like, is the prayer the icing, or is it the checked box in our way of being faithful Christians in that space? But I believe that starting the class with prayer is something so radical still to this day from what people experience in other classrooms, that we just can't lose it because it seems so easy to us to do. Instead, it really is an invitation, and especially in this time and these kinds of students who probably don't take a minute. They don't have moments of silence. They don't attend the way Jamie was talking about. They don't let go. They don't experience kenosis, right? This self-emptying that can happen in prayer. And so I think we do right by following the tradition that Brueggemann leads for us here to begin with prayer. So this is a prayer that's based on Psalm 96. So if you would bow your heads with me, I'm going to pray this song over us. We are a people who must sing you for the sake of our very lives. You are a God who must be sung by us for the sake of your majesty and honor. And so we thank you for the lyrics that push us past our reason, for the melodies that break open our givens, for cadences that locate us home beyond all our safe places, for tones and tunes that open our lives beyond control and our futures beyond despair. We thank you for the long parade of mothers and fathers who have sung you deep and true. We thank you for the good company of artists, poets, musicians, cantors, and instruments that sing for us and with us toward you. We are witnesses to your majesty and splendor. We will not keep silent ever again. Amen. In order to be here with you this week, I was not in my classroom. I love my students. And in order for them to not miss class, I needed someone to be there to take my spot. And a beautiful thing happened when one of my former students from John Brown University, who received his theology degree from University of St. Andrews, started working at Pepperdine this summer because I was able in complete confidence to ask this young man who's 28 now, I've known him since he was 18 and I first taught him, to come into my class and lead Plato's Republic. What I find miraculous about it is that I taught him and he can teach my students, and there's this beautiful passing on of the tradition that I'm getting to actually see and watch. My students told me when he substituted a few weeks ago, they're like, it was like he channeled you into the room, you know? Not that he's parroting at all any of the content that I gave him. That's way too long ago for him. But something about how I was able to teach in those spaces, to get him to love the things that I think are worth loving, to have him practice these habits of being human that I've practiced my teachers that I want to talk about this morning, and he's practicing me, and the students are practicing him and me, and there's this community around education that we're also even seeing in the book in front of us. We're reading Plato's Republic, and the craziest thing happened to me when I was teaching it last week. You know, I've been teaching this for almost 20 years, and I've never received certain questions, right? Students can still surprise you. The question I received was, what certified Socrates to get to lead these conversations? And I was like, wait, what? What certification did he have? That had never occurred to me, nor had it occurred to any of my students previously. And then as we're walking through the discussion, another one says, wait, why can't Socrates just let Thrasymachus think what he wants about justice, and Glaucon can think what he wants about justice, right? Why does Socrates feel the need to impress his own truth upon them? And it was just mind-boggling for me to think through the paradigms that they're coming from into this space, right? It's kind of like what Jonathan said the other night, the things they're bringing with them that have formed them, and then also the formation that we're hoping to see after our classes and after they leave, right? What is that formation? They come into this space expecting that Socrates needs a certificate, that each person in his discussion should just be able to have their own truth. They even asked, how is he grading them? How is Socrates grading them in how they live? And they're like, I don't even know what that means. This is what I have to try to move them towards. It's what I hopefully have moved a lot of students towards. It's what I want to keep doing with my life, is to take students who come in thinking that there's either no such thing as truth, or that each person is in charge of their own truth and in charge of their own story, and to go to a place where it's not the grade they walk away with, but it's the life that they're walking away with. The last couple of days have been very inspiring towards that end. I loved that our conversation began on Thursday night with, would the world even miss Christian higher education? I think it's the question the church is supposed to be regularly asking. I know my pastor used to ask it all the time. He used to say, would anybody miss us if this church didn't exist, right? And so when we go back into our spaces, how are we carrying that question forward? How are we going to answer that question? Is it by showing the true humanism that we talked about? And what does that look like? Some of the ways that the other speakers spoke about this and what education looks like for them, which is radically different than what my students are assuming education is, was about seeing, right? Hagar is seen by the Lord. He's the God who sees. We imitate that God. We need to see. It's about not making each of our students be autonomous individuals, the way Malcolm was pointing out, that they're not always in competition, that we're not always ranking them and assessing them just according to a number, that we know who they are and we see that they're in process, that they are a life being lived into a story. Or the way that Jonathan and Eric were talking about. Eric said the witness of his Princeton Christian academic group is joyful, less transactional. This is the kind of witness that we should be having, right? This is the come and see human flourishing that we want to show. This is the story we want to tell. And it's like Jonathan said, what story does not have them trying to save the world, What could it look like instead for Christian education to tell a different story? So the metaphor, the story that I want to hopefully bring to you today to kind of add to this conversation that has been developing over the last couple of days is a story of witness. And I'm going to tell you at least like 3 different ways that we might approach this, though there are numerous ones. The first one might come from an unexpected source for me to cite, for those who know me. But I was reading Elizabeth Elliot's biography. If you don't know me, then that's not surprising. But if you do know me, that's very surprising. And in this biography, there was a moment that I just kept coming back to. I read it, and I would remember it and kept recalling it. And it is after Jim Elliot has passed away. And Elizabeth Elliot is trying to figure out what to be doing in Ecuador. And she's studying the scriptures. And she said, you know, the word missionary is never used in scripture. But the word witness is, right? You are my witnesses, declares the Lord in Isaiah, right? This is something that Eliot suddenly had a paradigm shift from considering her life as a missionary to her life as a witness and what that might look like. I've had my own paradigm shifts along this line. When I was a young undergrad I actually went to Pepperdine for my undergrad, and I thought that I had to go do ministry because of how much I just loved the Lord. I mean, I enjoyed hearing Lindsay talk earlier that she loves Jesus, and everything she does, she wants to love Jesus in that space. She wants to love the people with the love of Jesus. I mean, that was me. That's what I wanted to do. That's what I wanted my whole life to look like. And so I thought that meant, do I need to go to China? Do I need to go into other places? Do I need to proselytize? Do I need to stand on a street corner? I mean, I was willing to what do I need to do? And if someone would have told me as an undergrad, you need to see and then you need to speak. Your entire life needs to be about attending, to see well, to use Eugene Peterson's translation, right? To have God-blessed eyes, and then to be able to speak and to tell about what you see. Now that might sound rather easy, but it's not, and it hasn't been in the history of the world. You look at stories like Anna Akhmatova was a Russian poet, and this is when the communists take over. And she eventually, she gets exiled. All these things happen over the course of her life. But there's this moment that's rather revealing when she writes a poem called Requiem. And she writes this thing that she calls instead of a preface, which is really a preface. And she says she's standing outside the Leningrad prison every day because she has family members unjustly imprisoned. And she's standing in line with other people. And they're all isolated from one another. They're all scared to talk because they don't know what else could happen to them. And they're in the cold, and they're shivering in despair. And at one moment, a woman turns to her and says, "Can you describe this?" She knows who Anna is. She knows she's a poet. And she whispers her hope. "Can you describe what we're going through?" And Anna says, "Yes." And in that moment, she said something like a smile went over what used to be a face. To be able to see and then speak is a prophetic gift of the church. To see things. We see things so differently than people who don't have the Spirit. We literally see things differently. Czeslaw Milosz, another communist victim, really, exiled again in the 60s because of communism. He says there's 2 classes of people in the world. It's a rather hopeless statement that I think there's actually a 3rd class, and I'm going to say that they're Christians. But he says there's 2 kinds of people. There's the ones who know and don't say anything, and then there's the ones who don't know and they keep talking. And the reality is there's a 3rd category. And that 3rd category are those who can see and then tell what they see. This is actually a prophetic gift. It is what witnessing means. It's observing. It's attending to. It's something that AI cannot do. We were having all these conversations about what is it that AI does that is different than human beings. AI can be smart. We can be wise. What does that look like? Right? What does that wisdom look like? It looks like seeing, contemplatively seeing the things in front of us. When you look at Jesus in the gospel, he's regularly asking, the Pharisees, like, how did you read this book, right? We all read the same thing. How are you not reading it the way that you should be, which is with a spiritual vision? This is what's different about what we're doing. It's when my colleague who's teaching what could just be a great books class makes the entire theme wrestling with God. And he starts with a vision from the Bible, and he reads the passage of Jacob wrestling with God, not only literally, though he is reading it literally with the class, but then spiritually, and takes that spiritual lesson and then applies it to the students' intellectual development, and then their moral character and moral response, so that they can, anagogically, know how to die. Because that's what we're called to do, is we're called to be able to die well. I would say that's the second meaning of witness. One of the things that Lucy Austin doesn't say in her biography of Eliot, she doesn't tie the connection between Elizabeth discovering that she needs to be a witness for God with Jim's death for God. But one of the other meanings of martyr, right? The Greek word means witness. What are you willing to die for will show what you're willing to live for. When Jamie presented, okay, do we have Benjamin Franklin values or martyr values? What does this look like? I wanted to say, we have martyr values. That just doesn't go over well. I even use the word value, which I can't stand. I actually ban it from my class. And I usually try to replace it with virtue when we have long conversations about the difference between value and virtue, right? This is Gertrude Himmelfarb's The Difference Between Value and Virtue. But the idea is that virtues are something that are inscribed upon our nature and the ways that we are created and the ways that we're supposed to be imitating God. And values are these things that you can evaluate whether it's valuable to you in that moment to behave that way or not. And I would say the distinction between those things comes down to what you think you're dying for. Because if what you think that you're dying for is Jesus, then the cost can't ever be too high. Right? T.S. Eliot, costing not less than everything. You're putting everything on the line. When we talk about what does this education cost us, we should be willing to pay every price. I know that there are some in this room that really agree with me, because when 2020 happened and there were a lot of us on Zoom and we were talking about Christian liberal arts education, and then all of us lost our jobs, some of us by choice. I chose, and it looked crazy to the world. I had a friend who said if he ever writes a biography of me, he's going to start with the story of how I quit my job in the middle of a hiring freeze that was across the whole country in the academic world, right? 2020, I quit my job because the cost they were asking for was the wrong cost. They had started, my university at that time, which I'm not going to denigrate because I think there's a lot of good that these schools are doing and it doesn't help to bring any of them down. But the choices that they were making was about numbers. It's what Jonathan said yesterday, when money enters the story, you've kind of already lost. If money is going to be the rubric of the story, if it's going to be the way that you think of the story. And so what happened? They were upping faculty efficiency ratios to get through the pandemic. Do you know what that means? Right? It means they were going to ask me to teach 11 classes in a year. I would never see my kids. And what mattered more was paying the cost of losing my job, losing my career, because what mattered more was discipling my children. Those are the kinds of things that we're trying to teach our students to evaluate, to be willing to say no to the wrong things and say yes to the right things, to imitate the good, like John writes in John 3, and not imitate what is evil. This goes back to what Jamie was saying the other night. You have to practice being human. And I would say this is the third category of witness that I want to touch on. How do you practice being human? I would say it's acknowledging the great cloud of witnesses. And that is both through the witnesses we interact with, as well as the stories that we read and the people that we learn about from the past. So I want to bring both of those things to the forefront. As someone who does great books education, I lean towards seeing what I'm doing as entering a story that began before me and continues after me and is filled with all the saints of the church, right? Even those non-saints whose voices I want to contend with, who lived before me like Nietzsche, right? Or the pagans that I want to know their stories. I want to know where they came from. One of my great teachers was Louise Cowan, who introduced me to this great books tradition. And Cowan writes this beautiful essay that actually was just republished last week in Modern Age called The Necessity of the Classics. And one of the things that she says there is that the classics are meaningless without being lived. If you're just reading them to test over them, to get the right answers from them, to reduce them to moralistic understandings, what have you done? But if you have read people like Antigone, and you see that her way of being human might be something worth imitating, and you enter into your life with a new kind of courage because you have this model or this witness inside of you, then suddenly when you're asked to do something subversive and beautiful for Christ, you might be more ready. You might have the storehouse within you that allows you to get through the despair, to get through the tough times, to be able to know how to act. The crazy thing about studying things like the 10 Commandments is that it wasn't a finished story. It was a to-do list. And it wasn't until we saw the narrative of Jesus Christ living it out that we knew how to do that, right? And the Spirit that enables us to have that same story so that we can read the story and interpret it by how we live. That's then what we're asking students to do with the kinds of stories that we're teaching them. We're reading these great books not because we're trying to be counter-revolutionaries. I never thought I would say that. It is mind-boggling to me that, like Peter said, I've actually had to make a career over the last few years convincing people to read books. It is crazy that I have to actually start first, not with just getting to teach Dostoevsky, but to go backwards and say, like, reading matters. Now can we talk about reading Dostoevsky, right? But it is in the culture we're in. To talk about, Eric said, his students are digital natives in a way that he could not even fathom. And that is true. How can we introduce them to this cloud of witnesses? How can we form their characters? I mean, this to me is not an answered question, but it's a real question that's constantly pressing upon my classroom, probably in your spaces. How do we as people of the book educate students in books that will help form them to be the kind of people that Christ calls them to be in imitation of the Word when they're digital natives? That's a radical ask. Some of them don't even know how to read these words and comprehend what is going on in a text. They don't have the attention that can last through a whole book. But if we think it matters that much, what do? There's some people that say, well, it doesn't matter. We'll just go back to like the pre-medieval times and we'll use images and I don't know, maybe that's a route. I still struggle. I still want to be the do not go gentle into that good night, It doesn't seem like our ways of catering to their inabilities has been helpful. It seems like the more that we have acquiesced to trying to teach content through films or through podcasts in our syllabus or through things that don't demand the struggle, it doesn't seem like that has helped their isolation, their despair, their meaninglessness. And what I have seen again and again is reading a book with a student in community has. that we have come up with this shared vocabulary, that we have felt like we are walking in this group. And they are mostly dead people, which I love. I inhabit a world full of ghosts. I mean, it is the communion of the saints. How can you feel lonely when you feel like Dostoevsky and O'Connor are right next to you all the time, trying to help you navigate this crazy life that you don't know how to live through? I think that's what it means to be a witness. Carolyn Forche, who wrote a book called The Poetry of Witness, she has actually one that coined the term poetry of witness, and I'm borrowing it to talk about an education of witness. She says that witness begets witness. Witness begets witness. When you see someone living a certain kind of life that you want, you then are imitating them, and then someone else sees you. What if all of our education was considered with that metaphor of witness? And that's what we're passing on, that we have all these witnesses begetting witnesses, and the great cloud of witnesses is getting larger and larger and larger. That's the metaphor that I'm hoping for, but I think it demands a few things from us, and that's what our conversations have been about. It demands that we see and be willing to speak. I don't know about you, but I'm regularly, sometimes I feel like I've been the only person at a faculty meeting who's been willing to be like, is this blasphemy? Like, does everyone else hear this? This sounds like blasphemy to me. Are we willing to be those people, right? This sounds crazy. Is this Christian? Where am I? I'm at a Christian institution. Why is everyone talking like this? This can't be real, right? Are we willing to be those people who see and speak? Are we willing to die for it? Are we willing to pay the cost? I love the way Malcolm talks, where he says, I'm in this job, God gave me this job. If they kick me out of this job, they kick me out of this job. God will put me where he puts me, right? Can we regularly just hold things that loosely that we know we are the empty hands of God, and he will use us wherever he uses us? We do not have to pretend to be a different kind of teacher to get tenure. We do not have to pretend to be a different kind of teacher because all of our colleagues are doing something that's not good teaching. We can just pay the price and continually stand up, and our witness might beget more witnesses if we're willing to die for certain things. And finally, I think we have to read. I think we have to read these witnesses. I'm going to end with this last story of where I really think witness has mattered. And so I'm going to give you a story of a person who is a witness that she may beget more witnesses. Her name is Anna Julia Cooper. And if you're not familiar with Anna Julia Cooper, she was born a slave in 1854. And she becomes one of the first, she's the fourth African-American woman to be a PhD from the Sorbonne. She lives to be 106 years old. And the only reason there's 3 African-American women before her getting PhDs is because they were her students, which is amazing in and of itself. She becomes the principal of what is now called Dunbar High School in DC, but at the time was called M Street High School. And she's in the middle of this controversy that takes place between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. It's an amazing story. Booker T. at the time is trying to help newly freed slaves claim a place in America. And so he does this by saying, let's make the white people realize that we have something they want. Let's do businesses that they can't live without. Let's be producers, right? This idea of producers and consumers. Let's be the kind of producers that they see our contribution to society, and then they will respect us. But what that means is we might have to just keep our place where they see us for a while, right? And W.E.B. Du Bois says, I'm having none of this. We are human. I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. I cross the color line with Balzac and Dumas, and I am not
going to stay in a place that I do not belong, that makes me be seen as less than human. This is the debate. And when it comes down to the education, how is that being practiced in this theoretical debate that they're having on a large scale? What does it look like on the ground? Anna Julia Cooper is in DC when Booker T. Washington is pressing on his white friends in power in the Board of Education. And they're pressing on him because Anna Julia Cooper's way of educating, which I'll tell you about in a second, is causing all of her black students to win the prizes at Yale and Harvard, and they're beating white students out for scholarships. And suddenly she's a threat. Because the kind of education she's doing is a classical education. She's on W.E.B. Du Bois' train, and she's saying, we need to teach Latin, we need to teach Greek. These are human beings, and we need to give them the resources that show the world these are human beings. She said, the question to ask is not what is the right education for an African American. The question to ask is what is the right education for a human? And I think we're doing the same thing right now, asking the wrong question. What is the right education for a chemist or a nurse or a future doctor? How can I use certain things? What's the right education for me to be a laborer or a producer or a consumer? That's the wrong question. You've already dehumanized the people you're talking about when you ask the question that way. Instead, Anna Julia Cooper says, what does it mean to be human? It means that you're a body with a soul. You have a head, you have a heart, and you have hands. And so the right education for those people are to read these beautiful stories, to memorize the speeches that Antigone gives and be ready to give them yourself. She had her students perform speeches in Greek. They had these words written on their hearts. And one of the things that I'm constantly scared of is that the more we're taking these books out and the more that we're taking this education away from our students, we are enslaving them in a different way. They are being controlled by markets, by media, and we have not given them the tools to be free. And we have to step back into the classroom and be ready to help free them, even from themselves, even from ourselves, in the ways that we too are enslaved. One of the questions that I can't help asking recently, and so I'll end with this question, is if you right now were facing a communist takeover, if totalitarianism was coming in some form, if you were in the midst of despair, what witness is written into you? What text are you interpreting with how you live? Do you know anything by heart in your very core other than, look at this stuff? Isn't it neat? Wouldn't you say my collection's complete? Wouldn't you say I'm the girl who has everything? That's from Little Mermaid. I think that our souls are more Disneyified and they're more controlled by the culture that we let consume us than by choosing the radically different way to witness to other things, such as the world is too much with us, late and soon. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. Little we see in nature that is ours. That's the kind of inscription we should want. That's the kind of inscription upon our students we should be willing to die for. And it's the witness I hope we are going to pass down so that that witness begets other witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that inspiring presentation. I'm going to risk a question that sort of synthetically combines some things that I've heard over the past few days and wonder if you might speculate on an answer, because I think it will involve some speculation. I feel like over the past few days, I have heard across the various presentations that the church generally, and the Christian university specifically, stands at a missiologically discernible frontier, on the other side of which there is collapse of society into barbarism and concomitant financial unsustainability of our present institutional forms. And that therefore, and this brings into your presentation today, that we need not simply to ask the theoretical question, what would I be willing to die for, but the practical question, given that I must die, what does new life look like on the far side institutionally? I feel like I've heard quite a bit of speculation over the past 2 days as to what the shape of a curriculum might be in Rising to New Life, but the institutional piece is important. I wonder if you might reflect a little bit about the institutional piece.
Yeah, I can. I also have been more thankful than ever before that I am not an administrator after this weekend. And I know Davey hates me saying that out loud. I would differ from Malcolm on this. I do believe in a Christian institution. And I actually do. I believe that an institution can somehow witness the character of Christ. There's got to be a way to do it. I really think that the church as we know it is where the body gathers. And so if enough of the body is gathered and doing church work together in an institution, can that be a Christian institution? I'm really hopeful about that, but it definitely has plagued me to think about this because it's not something that I had thought about in that way before. But because of that, that means that some institutions have to be ready to die. That's a scary thought. But I think that that is the reality that we're currently in. Now, because I'm not currently in charge of an institution, I am not responsible for all of those people and all of those jobs and all of that reality. And so I get the full weight of that. As persons within those institutions, right, are we going to have the peace of mind to know that it's okay when empires fall, right? And I am personally, I love Pepperdine. I have never been so happy to work somewhere, and I've worked multiple places. So I am thrilled to be there. I want to help it flourish. I moved my whole family there in the hopes that it flourishes, right? But I also know the reality of something like Fahrenheit 451, when the whole city turns into white baking soda in a powder, right? That's all that's left of the city. And then what walks forward are these people who've memorized Frederick Douglass, and they've memorized Plato, and they've memorized John Locke, and they've memorized Shakespeare, and they're walking out following the train tracks, waiting to see what's next. And one of them is quoting Ecclesiastes, trying to remember everything he remembers from Ecclesiastes, right? A time for this, a time for this. And I think that that's what we also have to kind of hold loosely. We have to be willing to fight for those good things, but know that our remnant and our witness continues when our institutions fall, right? When they have to die, we still live, we're still there. And I think that's the constant tension maybe to kind of walk through. So it doesn't answer your question maybe directly, but I'm trying to give hope where I think that there should be hope for these institutions. This is the least amount of hands that we've seen over the last 2.5 days. I think we've had these long Q&As.
Yeah, don't take it personally.
Time.
I think we're all.
I'm so won over to this, and this is such a.
I'm just talking. I'm really won over to what you're saying. And at the risk of undercutting what I've chosen to do, because I think I'm following the Lord's call, to say that this form of education is the truly human form of education. We just built a cafe. We worked with a lot of tradesmen.
there's opportunities in my town for my kids to potentially go to like a classical Christian school. And for theological reasons, my husband and I are different pages. For theological reasons, I want to keep them in a school that's just okay. And honestly is malforming them in like some pretty obvious ways. But I feel torn. I'm really torn about taking them out of that system to put them over here. And yes, I work in a Christian higher ed. So I want to be on board with an education that has really shaped me. And I'm really nervous about denigrating the kinds of vocations that I don't think get the respect that they're due, who don't follow that path. But they're truly human.
Yeah.
And they have a wisdom that is discernible and valuable. So I'm not trying to have you solve the problem of where I should put my kids in school, but I'm genuinely torn about this. I think there's something valuable about Christian higher ed, so I work in it. I think it's unique. I get really nervous about thinking it's like the only truly human. I know you're not saying that probably, or maybe you are.
No. If I can, I mean, really, this is a question that I get regularly asked because a lot of times I speak about education. I like looking back in history to how schools began. A lot of it began out of the Sunday school movement. So it was born first from like church ways of thinking about education and how to form people. And my family, so my husband's first gen, he was actually pulled out of school when he was in 8th grade to work on his family farm, and that's all he did. And then when he was in his mid-20s, started looking around and wanted something different. So my dad's first gen, my grandfather was Air Force. My great-grandfather only read the Bible his entire life. He knew it chapter and verse by heart. It was the only book he ever read, right? And he was a cattle rancher. So I don't come from a place in which I think that there's one calling. I do still believe in the reality of the books and the ways that they form us. Now, what that looks like right now, given the system we're in, a lot of times you can't find those books in that formation except in some of these places. And that's the part that's troubling. I have no issues with public schools where teachers are on board with this kind of education, where they're loving their students and they're wanting to read with their students and they're wanting to form their students. Like, that's happening everywhere, right? In all different schools. My concern is when we're not doing that in some of those spaces, is that the kind of formation that we want? And I think every family has to answer that for every kid in a different way, right? I have 4 children and not a single one of them is the same. And so what does that look like for each one of them to be formed, right? One of them currently homeschools, one of them right now is in a different private school, and another one's in another private school because they need different formations. And so I do believe in the church calling and the open vocation, but I also very much think that these resources we can give them benefits people. And I wish the system was open enough that people basically could become farmers or tradesmen and be reading books. That used to be the culture, right? There was something always where people were still doing that in a way that we've kind of lost. Do you see that same kind of thing happening where people just don't even imagine that you need these resources from any tradition?
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to linger on this.
Yeah. I think it's a really important question.
My students, my son's classroom are sleeping in their cars right now.
Yeah.
The thought of like,
Yeah, like, and how do you help them and witness them and be with them, right? Like, I think this is a real question. The school that I started was in a rural community where this was not a reality. The majority of our parents were actually farmers who had never received any sort of education themselves. That's not the background that they were coming from. Our school was $2,500 a year because I wanted to price it as low as possible to get as many people in there as possible. And even still, we took from 4 different families, and they knowingly knew that we were taking from them to be able to serve people. So when I think through these kinds of responses, it's because I'm very hopeful that in the midst of those situations, you can give good words to people. That's what I want. I want to be able to give good words to people that are in need. I want the church to be that resource somehow when I'm thinking about forming them. So I'm not trying to think in an elitist way or a way that doesn't see the needs. I think that if we stop seeing the needs, then we haven't even actually learned from the books. We haven't sat under them at all, right? We've held them over other people and stomped on the people who didn't have access to them. And then there was no point. So I think what you're bringing up is not a question that doesn't deserve lingering on. I think it does. Okay, yeah.
I think it's me. I've been trying to figure out how to ask this question in some form for like 3 days, so hopefully it will work out. One thing I want to say is it feels like schools like this were established so that somebody in the community would have that kind of formation and then take it back to the communities. When people got to Washington State, they didn't think they were sending people back to be major players in the cities. They just wanted to get a good preacher for the little small towns with the logging, right? So there's something core that we're doing and carrying forward that tradition. And I get real inspired talking about that. And then I also have this really practical set of questions that look like this. And this is the question I can't quite figure out how to form. It's basically like, do we need a history department? Or what is the value of the traditional liberal arts breakdown of subjects as we think about what we're doing? Because from admissions all the way through, students will come in and say, well, I need to be a doctor because I have to make money, so I can't major in philosophy. And we go, yes, we'll take care of that, instead of saying, oh, but do you want to study philosophy? All the way through. So is there value in that? And my concern to add on to that is I look at what's happening at small colleges all over the country, and a lot of them collapse, the little liberal arts departments until you have a division of humanities with 15 hardworking, interesting people doing good work, but you're less likely to spend a whole semester thinking about books.
Yeah.
There's a question in there somewhere, I think.
No, I think this is a really good question, and this goes back to Matthew's question a second too, which is, what do the institutions do and what do they need to look like? So I'll try to address it in a few different ways. One, when those students come to us, I am very tired of catering to them. I'm very tired of it. I think that us not asking more of the students is doing damage to the students. And so I regularly tell my colleagues, we just cannot just give to this 18-year-old. We have to imagine this person as a 30 to 40 to 60-year-old, and what are we giving them right now that's gonna help them be that 30, 40, 60-year-old, right? So I'm on that track. It's also hard to, I'm going to use the word preach, but preach what I preach, which is the life of a martyr when my school cost almost $90,000 a year. Because I really believe in the necessity of following Plato, but in an ideal world, people would just come to my house and we would just talk through Plato every day, and I wouldn't grade them, and they would just learn to be martyrs, and they could go into whatever trades or fields that they were going to be doing. So I'm not happy with the system the way that it currently is. I know what I can do within it, and I am very hopeful after this weekend to think through ways of changing it, right? I mean, the vampire analogy that Jonathan kept bringing up, that's a very difficult metaphor. I will say Pepperdine helps quite a bit because we cater to this top 1% of people. They pay for all the other students. I was full ride when I went there for 4 years. They paid for people like me. So it was more of a church model for those who have the money, you just pay full ticket, and those who don't, you don't pay anything, right? And there's people in between. And so it was helpful in that sense. But I think that our institutions really do need to reckon with humanities. I love it. I think it should be the life of every person. Do you have to pay that much to get access to it? That's the part that I struggle with. This is why Davey and Jeff and I put together the Liberating Arts book, because it shows a bunch of other opportunities where the Clemente course in humanities, which by the way, I don't know if people know this, but the book, we chose that the money it makes goes to other places. So for example, Clemente course in humanities was funded, we gave the money to them. And what they do is they pay for people to have humanities education for free. They pay for the childcare and the transportation. It's an amazing way of accessing liberal arts. I feel like there has to be more and more of that happening to give the kind of education that these students need, because when they are paying $90,000 a year, they do want to be a lawyer or a doctor, because they know they're going to have to pay it back. But I still want them to be a philosopher in their soul. and I want to know how to do that well. Hi.
Hi, Jessica. It was wonderful hearing you in person for the first time. So thank you so much for that. And I'm going to ask a question that you know I'm probably going to ask. And as you know, I always sort of feel like an interloper at places like this on Christian education, because even though I am a person who grew up in the church and grew up in faith, I did not grow up in the Christian education world, and I was not trained in the Christian education world. And I was trained at a place where I learned to read womanist theology, and I learned to read non-Western texts, and that has made me carry concerns to a form of Christian education that is rooted in a white tradition. And that even when it includes marginalized voices, they're always on the periphery. They are not centered in the text. You know, even a text that starts with Plato and Aristotle is sending a message about what's important and what does it mean to be human, and human is white. And we have seen the, I think with the hijacking of this classical model in a far right group that is also rooted in Christian nationalism and white supremacy, shows us the danger of this type of education. Is there a way that we can keep what is good, but also expand this vision of what it is to be human that is not exclusively in the white tradition?
Yes.
That's a huge question, and I'm so sorry.
No, but I also get asked it enough that it doesn't floor me, because it's something I'm regularly asked. And Beth and I were talking earlier this morning, like, this is a question that I didn't wrestle with when I finished my undergrad, but I was only taught primarily, like I was taught Jane Austen and Frederick Douglass, but like primarily I was taught the Western tradition and just white male voices. And it wasn't until I went to Baylor and my first semester of teaching, Scott Moore said, okay, so one of our requirements for teaching ancients is that you have to also include non-Western voices and women. And I was like, were there women? Like, I had zero idea. I felt so stupid in this moment. Like, I'm about to teach this class. I didn't know any non-Western voices. I didn't know any women. Like, I had no idea that people wrote before Jane Austen. Like, at all, when I graduated college. And that was just, how did I get through 4 years of college not knowing that women had written before Jane Austen? Which has led me to where I currently am, writing a book on women in the great tradition, because it just opened my entire world. So for example, the program that I was brought back to at Pepperdine is moving probably more of a direction where George Fox was mentioning they were this morning. So I'm gonna just speculate based on what you guys said, but I was very encouraged over a 6-semester sequence of great books, but not the great books, in which it sounds like it's a lot more integrated canon of Epic of Gilgamesh and so forth, Egyptian Book of the Dead, I'm assuming these kind of things, right? Like the great books. This is where I have been headed over the last 5 or 6 years for sure, and have been very much promoting, but also it's the reason that as often as I get called a colonialist by those who think I'm only teaching dead white men, I've also regularly been called woke because I'm not. You know, like I'm in this space where I'm trying to say like classical education and great books is good, and when Christian nationalists hear that, they're like, yes, and then I say something like, let's look at Epic of Gilgamesh, and they're like, who are you? You betrayed us. Right? And they don't, like, there's this constant tension to fight this fight right here that I'm trying to fight that I think is necessary to fight. It goes back to what you and Malcolm were saying yesterday about seeing. If all these students ever see is the white perspective, then that's all they're getting. But I also know people like Frederick Douglass read Cicero and Plato, and he was liberated by it.
So it also has its own tension within the tradition, because Douglas is up in his attic reading this and saying, it gave vocabulary to the emotions I never knew I had. That's freeing. So there's something freeing still in this book, despite that it comes from this tradition, right? Like it has been liberating. And we can't forget that it's been liberating. But it's not the only thing that can be liberating, right? And so there's also, I want to say a both and. These texts have been liberating for people. We should keep teaching them. We are not going to forget them and lose them, and I want to hold on to them. At the same time, to be able to see yourself in a text and not always be forced to put on a certain kind of identity perspective in order to receive that liberation, but to see that it also comes from people that look like you or come from your past or have your shared identity and history is also immensely valuable for people understanding their belonging, especially in a very isolated culture. So we have to hold on to both. And that's one of the things that Pepperdine's actually invited me to do. That's why they've brought me, because we have been doing great books for 40 years. It began with Mortimer Adler. If you know anything about Adler, Adler said the reason that there are no women or persons of color included is because they haven't written anything good, right? He says that up until 1990. So my program was founded first with this understanding, and now I'm trying to move it into a place where it sees that the whole human tradition really is a whole human tradition.
I was fascinated by the part where, or an element that came up in the end, where you were talking about the role of memory. And so I've often heard of memory as the neglected or forgotten part of the rhetorical canon.
Yes.
And thinking about the challenges and the possibilities of refocusing on memory. And I think while you're talking about education as witness, that maybe memory, like where you were giving the examples at the end of like memory as witness or memory as the witness in the place of experience. And so wondering what you see as how to start to approach the challenges and the possibilities of the role of memory in this education we're endeavoring to do.
Yeah. This is actually something I've given entire talks to and written whole chapters on because I love it so much. So if you read, Mary Carruthers is one of my heroes in this work, the medievalist who does like the Book of Memory and the craft. She's amazing. So just the Craft of Thought, all of that, she's great. So I'm going to be like a footnote to her and just translate some of her ideas here. But one of the things that she, again, paradigm shifted me, is that I grew up thinking canons of rhetoric meant you invent something, then you organize those thoughts, then you make them stylized, then you memorize them, then you deliver them. 5 canons of rhetoric. And she shows, actually the reality was everything began with memory. That's the wrong order. It's memory, invention, organization, style, delivery. It's the reason that I can do what I just did here, which is speak without notes or without a paper, because it's first, what do I actually remember that I can then, from that inventory, into something and arrange in such a way and then stylize as I'm doing it in my delivery, right? These are all like the canons were reorganized for me. We cannot have imagination without memory. You can't invent if you don't have an inventory, is the kind of language that she uses. And that's the reality, is that a lot of our students are coming at either blank slates or what's actually more likely, been impressed upon about the malformation by their culture. So they're only coming with a limited kind of memory, right? A limited number of sources. I'll give one example from Switzerland this summer. My 11-year-old was hearing the students like around her, and she said, can we listen to Ice Spice? And I was like, that's not one of the Spice Girls. It's Baby Spice, it's Sporty Spice. I had zero, and all the students start laughing, and I was like, I had zero idea that there was like some new rapper, Ice Spice. My whole world was like, I know Ginger Spice, like I know the Spice Girls, right? And it was also a really telling moment for me because it's like, I know my students are coming with these cultural frameworks, and I know a lot of professors who try to like
be cool and like call on like I will never be cool. So one, I'm just like not even gonna try. The other thing is what I'm introducing them to is a better thing to have in their memory than what they currently have. And I can actually know that and have hope in that. Now, it doesn't mean that, like, I love what they bring to the table. I don't want anyone to hear opposite. I love what they bring to the table. But also what I've invited them to is a feast of discourse. If I'm doing my job, then I'm bringing the good and the true and the beautiful things in front of them that we're getting to share. And those are gonna become parts of their memories that actually maybe form them in a more positive way. Hopefully the way that they actually want to be formed. That would be the goal.
So I'm hoping you can be my memory for me. There's a Flannery O'Connor quote that I love where she says, people without hope don't write novels. What's more, they don't read them. They don't have the courage to, see, I already lost it. To take long looks at anything. This is how, right? You know this quote?
Yes, yeah.
You have it in there?
Yeah, well, yeah, because they don't have the attention, to go back to what Jamie was saying, right?
Yeah.
They have no desire to attend to the things, yeah.
Yeah, right. So I'm always talking with my students about taking long looks at things, because the thing that, I mean, teaching in an honors college or whatever sounds rad. I teach in rural Iowa to like ag majors who don't want to read, and my learning objective is that they will read a book sometime in their life after they come out of my class. And the thing that I feel like they're missing, and I don't know how to help really, is just like curiosity.
Yeah.
Right? I always tell them, like, everybody wants to be interesting, right? The best way to be interesting is to be interested. And so how do you, I don't know if they buy that or not, but like, how do you teach curiosity?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think of Thoreau, who said he had not yet met a man who was fully awake, right? That most people are not. And I think that this is even worse with media. Jeff Bilbro yesterday presented on AI and some of the fears with AI. I'm probably with him. I'm not as much of a Luddite as Jeff is, but I'm still very fearful of what we've actually done to students. Is we've killed their curiosity. Jeff was mentioning that a first grader he caravans with, like he takes to school when he goes and drops off his daughter, like she just turns on her iPad videos during class breaks because they have ear pods. So if she finishes her work, then she watches videos in between while other students finish their work. Like, we are literally entertaining ourselves to death. We have students who've just lost the ability to be bored and curious and attentive. And so I try to get my students back into those spaces as much as possible. I can't believe that that's what discipleship looks like right now, but it is. It means just trying to wake them up. So I had students recently, so I was teaching a chapel class, which I volunteered to teach for 3 weeks. We're trying to like redo our chapel program. And so they had all the faculty basically get 50 students. So these are like, so don't care. Like their lack of care like needs a whole nother word for how much they don't want to be in this space with me. And so there was 50 of them, they were just stuck in this room with me. And I'm trying to talk to them about beauty for 50 minutes for 3 weeks. That's all I have. And the very first day, of course, the phones are out. And I was like, I only get 50 minutes with you. I'm just gonna count you absent if I see your phone. Like, that's it. I'm just gonna count you absent. By the last week, we're going to the art museum, and they're getting to see these amazing pieces of art that are on campus. And the curator is kind of walking them through and asking them questions like, what do you see? You know, what are you looking at? And they're like looking at their phones, even though we've already had like this conversation. And I stood up at the very end and I just cried in front of all of them. And I was real with them and I said, I am so sorry. I'm so sorry that you are so enslaved to your devices that you don't know how to look at art anymore. I'm so sorry that our culture has completely failed you. But if you have a moment that you can put away your phone and spend maybe 5 more minutes here, I think you would feel free for 5 minutes. And a lot of them stayed. They had never even thought of doing that. I think they've been so programmed to just use, if somebody's not asking something of them, I'll use my phone while they're just telling me to look at this thing, right? And so I think those moments of wake up is so much what we're asked to do for them. Just wake up. And I do think it has to come, though, from a place of love and relationship and care. And so even though there were 50 of them that I was only seeing for 3 weeks, like I tried as much as possible to love every single one of them and know their names for just 3 weeks. And I think that's a good starting place. It's at least all I could think to offer. Last question.
I'm an administrator. I oversee enrollment and marketing. Most of the speakers, and there's no problem with that, are in honors colleges or Princeton, or that represents a very small percentage of students going to college, and kind of a self-selected, high-achieving. Many of them have.
Can I add something right there before you go to your question?
Yeah.
I am so grateful to be at Pepperdine. I started in January. I've been at 5 other schools. I've been places where the GI Bill was paying for most of the students' education, and they didn't have, like, they had no ability to even physically read. So, like, I've got 18 years of, like, teaching everywhere you can possibly imagine, just FYI.
Yeah, no, and that's actually not the primary point.
Okay.
My question is, for the 90% who are not in the honors programs at our schools or things like that, the majority really, like when I am at a fair with 16-year-olds that want to go to college, they all want to be doctors, lawyers, or engineers. Now, we know that most people don't become doctors, lawyers, or engineers. And that's, I think, for the academically motivated non-honors type of student. What does success look like for the mean, the middle? What does kind of proximate justice look like in our colleges for someone who just wants to be a mechanical engineer or an accountant or something like that?
I love that you mentioned both of those, because my dad was an accountant and my husband's an engineer. So this would be my reality. My dad, as an accountant, spent half their grocery bill getting an Easton Press book delivered to his house every month. So they ate bologna boats. Do you know what bologna boats are? You take bologna and you put mashed potatoes in the middle of them and you put grated cheese on top. And that's what I grew up eating when I was in kindergarten, because my dad was spending money on a book every month to read a classic. That would be my goal. And so when I think about what success looks like, my family just didn't have a lot of money when I was growing up, but my dad read us Shakespeare on Saturday mornings. I didn't even know what he was talking about most of the time, but I loved it. I tell my students all the time, I don't want them to major in English. They don't have to major in history. I'm so glad now to be finally at a school where great books is not a major, because I don't want my students to specialize in this or have the assumption that this is a specialty. Right? I want my colleagues who teach math, which one of them, for years, like he's been a mathematics teacher and he now teaches great books with us. That's what I want, is that when they graduate and walk across the stage, the classes that helped form them were the history classes and literature classes, and they loved things worth loving. So that when they go and their day is 9 to 5 and they're doing accounting 9 to 5, they go home at night and they know to read to their kids and they want to read to their kids. And they don't say, I want to turn my brain off. I want to zone out. I want to be done thinking. I want them instead to have something to worth living for, right? Which a lot of times, is those moments of getting to sit with your 4-year-old and read a story. That's kind of what I'm going for when I think about the students I teach that are not going into the humanities. Okay, thank you.
Thanking Jessica. One quick announcement before a couple closing remarks. If you happen to be hanging around and have some time to spare and you wanted to grab lunch, I think Davey and I, maybe a couple others, are going to grab an informal lunch after this. If you'd like to join us, just come find us and we'll make that happen. A couple words of thanks. I wanted to thank, as well as Jessica, our plenary speakers. Most of them I think have had to leave, but Jamie's still here, so let's give a thanks to them. I'm very thankful for Davey and for his hard work on this. I'm impressed and thankful that you're here right now and that you've been so engaged this weekend. Right, in a perfect world, I would not be here doing this job right now. I came in, as Davey said, as a closer in the bottom of the ninth. And if that metaphor works, then I came in with a 10-run lead. And this was a very easy job to finish off, thanks to Davey and all his hard work. So thank you, Davey. Thank you, Bob and Andrea. It was so nice to have a meal with you last night. So thankful for your help in making this conference happen. I think Joe Creech had to leave. I'm thankful for Joe and for the Lilly folks. A few of you are still hanging out here. I want to thank Annie. Annie's fairly new to the Whitworth team, but I have been so impressed, Annie, by your competence and your amazingly hard work and your incredible wisdom in decision making. So thank you, Annie, for that. Yeah. I spend a lot of time in this lecture hall, and it's not often that I feel the sort of Christ-centered energy pulsing through it. I was reflecting with my wife, Lauren, she's campus pastor here last night, about how wonderful that has felt. I'm so thankful, Scott, that you've been sitting there in your spot, usually with Janice this whole weekend. It's been so encouraging to see. I've been so thankful for all the Whitworth folks who have been a part of the conference, who have hosted sessions, who have led sessions. It makes me hopeful for what is going to come after this, and so I hope that the rest of you can take some of that same feeling back to your places with you. Last night, as I was trying to process all of this and think about what's going on, I wrote this prayer for myself and really, I guess, for Whitworth. I think maybe also it applies to all of us, so I will close us with a prayer. We thank you, God, that you are a God who desires to be with us. And we are grateful that you came to dwell among us in the person of Jesus. As that man from Nazareth, Lord, you entered into the process of learning. You grew in wisdom, thereby sanctifying this journey of learning, growth, and formation. May we as educators honor that process with the sacred dignity it deserves. Lord, I pray that our commitment to you would be a load-bearing commitment, that the image of your Son, crucified and resurrected, would define and determine who we are as an institution. So may the education we offer not be infatuated with producing and consuming and competing and hoarding and storing up, but may it draw us and our students into a radical life of sharing, bearing burdens, and walking humbly with you and each other. In the person of Jesus, you refused power and glory and comfort, but instead insisted on justice and righteousness, suffering and vulnerability. May we share in that wisdom by knowing when to cheerfully refuse and when to passionately insist. Grant us, God, the courage to be faithful. We see in Jesus that you chose to die rather than abandoning your mission, that when faced with a choice, death is the more faithful alternative. I pray that we, through your Spirit, could share in that same faithfulness. We trust, God, that you hold the future of all things, which means that you hold the future of Christian higher ed. In that trust, may our anxiety and fear be transformed into a joyful freedom to do with wholehearted abandon the unique things you are calling us to do today. May we trust that even if we weren't to exist, your kingdom would still come. But may we also trust that here and now, amidst all the uncertainty, you have called us and our institutions to witness to your coming kingdom. So may we leave this place longing for the endless immensity of your goodness and your love and your beauty. And may that longing lead us into humble and grateful work of building institutions that might, by your grace, be part of the process by which your kingdom comes. We pray this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, thank you, friends. It's been so great being with you. As you go from this place, may the Lord bless you. Go in peace.